Fashion. It's what I initially created using my mom's sewing machine. Perhaps you wouldn't categorize my first project, a gathered skirt, as fashion. Still, I was smitten by the process, then and now. Linda Lee, the creative force behind the sewing workshop, shares my penchant for sewing. She's with us to share the latest in runway finishes for cool edges. Linda, fashion sewing is once again taking center stage, but not everyone knows the proper way of working with fashion fabrics and even how to choose the fabrics.
Well, there is that huge process of deciding what to make something out of, but seam finishes seem to be the stumbling block, and they're very important in the overall look of a garment. You can make them very basic, you can make them very fashionable, but all of them can be simple process, takes a little practice. So I have some guidelines that I can share with you today.
We're going to start with the lotus skirt.
The lotus skirt is one of my favorites because you can take the hems of this skirt and turn it so that it's completely finished, and then you turn the mitered corner and it turns into a garment that you can see beautifully on the inside and the outside.
Runway finishes for cool edges. That's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, a complete line of sewing, quilting, and embroidery machines and sergers. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Madeira, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Koala Studios, fine sewing furniture custom built in America. Clover, makers of sewing, knitting, quilting, and embroidery products for over 25 years. Experience the Clover difference. And amazing designs and Class A needles.
To start our program on runway finishes and cool edges, you notice that we're going to start with mitered corners. And Linda, this is a great design of a skirt, but there are other skirt patterns that may have, or other garments that may have these great mitered corners.
Oh, you'll find them in a lot of garments, even when the pattern doesn't call for it.
Yes, you can add them, and what a wonderful finishing touch. You also have a silk sheer made into an elegant napkin. What a beautiful finish.
You can see the interior of the architecture of what's happening.
The great details make all the difference. So we're going to show you how to accomplish that. And you've made some little template patterns.
I've used a manila file folder, and I've cut it into two different sizes. One is the finished hem width, and one is the hem allowance.
So you have 1 1/4 and 1 3/4 for strips.
So I've already pre-pressed one side.
And you pressed under, first of all, the 1 3/4, excuse me, and then let me just show that, how that happened. And then you did the 1 1/4.
That's right, and you put that in the crease that you've just made.
So you can do that again, you'll see that.
We're going to do this on the adjacent corner. So you start a distance away from the raw edge so that you can bring the raw edge up and over the template and press so that the iron is pushing the fabric against the template, and you can see that that raw edge is lining up with that edge of the template.
And that first edge, you keep it in the press position.
Keep that. That's correct. That's important. And then you use the smaller one to bury that in the crease that you've just made so that you don't have to calculate what to press up and over. All you do is just press what's left.
In this fabric, because it's linen, just loves to be pressed.
Absolutely. So the next step is to make sure those hems are pressed on top of one another. And all you need is 2 pins. One pin goes in the hem allowance only, perpendicular to the hem. The other pin is perpendicular to the hem, and so you've made this little X with the pins.
Then meeting right sides together.
That's right. Then you put them together, and your job is to match the pins exactly.
There we go. Now there's a need of a marking tool, and we're going to just match these pins, and I'll lay that down for you because you have the mark that you pressed into the hem.
See where this diagonal line dies? At the corner.
We'll just hold that up.
Now all you have to do is draw the line from the pins to that crease line.
And through the magic of samples, we have that sewn on this sample, just that 45-degree line, and then you would next do the trimming.
That's right.
And after trimming, I'll let you do this, you're the master.
All right. You can do this over a point presser so that it's really a nice crease, but you put your thumb in this little, what I call bonnet, and press that open, and it'll turn really easily. And if you need to, you can use a bamboo point turner to give it a little press, but you know, sometimes you don't always have to really do that.
And ta-da!
And there you have it.
Very good. Now, beautifully done, and some patterns call for an asymmetrical closure where you have the hem one width and the facing another width. And on the blouse that's next to you, behind you, you have that great asymmetrical hem, and you can see the seam allowance is on an angle. So in this instance, we have two different widths, which you've already pressed.
That's right. So the same thing happens. Your pins are in the same position. You open out the hems, and your job is to match the pins. But see, the difference this time is that these two edges do not line up. But you don't care what happens with that, and you don't care what's happening out here. Your job is still just to match from the pins to that same point, and what you get is this asymmetric corner.
And after you stitch that, it just works because of the magic of pinning and pressing. A Hong Kong finish is an accepted couture technique to finish seam edges. Linda uses the very traditional finish in an untraditional way, turning the finish to the right side. Her era jacket with the facing piece brought to the outside has great runway appeal. The Hong Kong finish on the edge of the seam gives it a trendy detail. Not only are you going to learn about great finishes during this series, but also see your great fabric choices, Linda. This is a phenomenal combination.
It's an interesting combination of a boucle in wool using some silk dupiones and some kimono pieces, some remnants from some old kimono.
The detail we're going to look at right now is this Hong Kong finish that is on the facing. Now, generally the facing scoots to the underside. Here you have it as a showcase.
Right, I cut off the facing and then actually sewed it to the edge again and brought it to the outside. And the hem has just been folded to the outside instead of the inside of the garment.
And then again, you can see what we're going to show you right now. It's a lot of straight stitching. It's not difficult at all.
No, it just takes a couple of tools and a couple of pins, and
I like
there you
that.
have it, yeah.
So you're going to sew the seam, first of all, or finish the facing edge. And we have a seam that has been stitched in this gray, beautiful gray linen fabric. And then you've cut the seam finish fabric. And this is...
I like to use China silk because it's no bulk.
It's very lightweight.
So you want something that's not going to create a lot of
now,
heftiness.
another option would be...
silk dupioni, broadcloth.
Yeah. So you have some options.
Yes.
And then this is cut 1 1/4 inch on the bias. It has that give.
It must be on the bias, even if you are sewing it on something straight. It will fold over the edge much smoother. So after you've sewn this to the edge, I like to use a 1/4 inch wide foot, a presser foot that already has a toe on it that width.
And here's that foot that's 1/4 inch wide. And here you can see a close-up of stitching the China silk to just the layer of the seam allowance with a 1/4 inch seam allowance.
Just one side of the seam allowance.
At a time.
And after you've done that, you want to use your hands to manipulate the next step. This is not something where I press it with an iron to make it wrap around. I use my fingers to manipulate this. And then what I like to do also is place a pin parallel to this seam that's going to happen.
Now, the presser foot that works best for this technique is an edge joining foot. It has this pliable center mark, and that's going to be placed in the well of the seam. And here you can see how that's stitched. You're stitching in the ditch using the edge joining foot.
And if you're using matching thread, you won't even see that, of course. Now, depending on what fabric you're using for the wrap, then sometimes you will have a little bit of excess on the back side. And you might want to use some applique scissors to just trim a little bit of that
sure.
excess away. Most of the time you don't need it, but occasionally you do.
We're going to take a look at a few more garments that have been created with the accent of the Hong Kong finish, exposed again in this instance on the side seams.
That's right. This garment was actually made by Deborah Young from Michigan, and she chose to put these Hong Kong finishes on the outside, and so these have been sewn down in this ditch so that the seam will just lie flat.
So the seam is, instead of having right sides together, you sew the seam with wrong sides together.
Yes, that's right. And I love the way she's extended this Hong Kong into the seam of the arm opening that's also brought to the outside of the garment.
Now, traditionally, with a Hong Kong finish, when years and years ago when I learned how to do this, it was the inside. The Hong Kong was kept on the inside, and that's what we have on Linda's great green jacket. On the inside, the facing and the seams as well as the hem have the Hong Kong finish. You can see that the facing and the seams are the traditional 1 1/4 inch width. Beautiful, beautiful combination.
And this is a bulky fabric, and you can still do it on that as well.
So, Hong Kong finish. It's a great way of adding an accent on the outside or the inside of your runway jacket. The Valencia jacket may be made in a variety of fabrics. Linda chose a sheer fabric, a silk sheer, for this variation. Notice how the fabric flows. By opting to finish the outer edges with what she calls baby hems, the drape of the fabric is not compromised. Here are the simple yet effective steps. What I love about this program is just seeing the beautiful fabrics that Linda has chosen to sew with and to create the fashions. And this is a beautiful silk, and the sheer is drapeable. But I have to admit, if I didn't know her technique, which I just recently learned, it would be difficult to do this finish along the edges. Whether it's silk or another type of fabric, you could simply use this on your favorite pattern where you have a single layer. Now, because this is a sheer, we're going to be using a fine universal needle, a small universal needle, and we would recommend cotton thread, lightweight cotton thread as a magic sewing tool to create the edge finish. Now, Linda, you have a 3-step process for sewing this.
I do. Hopefully this can tame this fabric for you.
Yes.
Well, the first thing I do is establish my finished hem length. And I sew a straight stitch through a single layer of fabric along that finished hem.
So you're using a stitch length of about 2.0.
Yes, shorten it just a little bit. Then right along that stay stitching line, I want to fold the fabric with my hands, not with an iron, with my hands. And I also have threaded a short little bit of thread on a needle, hand sewing needle, and knotted it. I'm going to take a little whip stitch here so that I am anchoring this to the end of the fabric. That allows me to be able to get this fabric through the sewing machine. Now I am using a special foot, this edge stitch foot, and I've moved my needle position over.
And the edge stitch foot is the same foot we used earlier to do the Hong Kong finish.
That's right. But this thread behind here allows me to begin the feed of the fabric. Otherwise, it's likely to get kind of balled up. So if you can see that the blade of that foot is following the fold, and I am sewing just very close as I can to that edge. And I'll refold that, and now I can give that a little tension, I call it.
Sure.
So once I've sewn the length of that,
And she's sewn very close to the edge, which you'll soon see.
then I've attached the end of this to what's called a third hand. And I want to take my applique scissors and very carefully lay those flat so that I can trim as close as I can to that stitching.
Very pretty. But we're not done.
Oh no, we're not done. We're not done. Now we're going to take this fabric and turn it one more time. Still using the edge stitch foot and that really close stitch next to the fold, and you're going to turn it one more time so that you end up with this very small little 1/8 inch wide hem.
And there are 3 rows of stitches in there, really.
You see 2 on the wrong side and 1 on the right side.
And once you get going and to stitch it, it really goes very smoothly.
That's right.
And that edge stitch or edge joining foot, whatever you'd like to call it, will help you in that process. And again, let's just take one more look at the garment. But I'm going to show you another option that you could do for shears, whether it's with a garment or a scarf. There's another option. And that's something that both of us learned a long time ago.
A long time ago.
And it is a hand sewing method to do the baby hems and sheer fabrics. And you may also want to use the third hand to hold the fabric. I'm just going to show this to you using 2 hands, but it's with a hand sewing needle. I've pressed under about 1/8 inch, and then you, with your matching thread, not contrasting thread, take a stitch along the fold, a small stitch, and then you zigzag down, or you stitch down, and I'm making these exaggerated below the pressed area. Then you go back up along the fold about 1/4 inch apart, and then right directly below the cut edge. You can see that large zigzag. Then if it's smaller, you simply hold this and pull. And when you pull, it turns under perfectly. And that's another option for a baby hem. A crisp finish along a shirt tail or a handkerchief hem is a sign of a well-made classic shirt. This process may be categorized as a couture technique, yet don't let the name fool you. Straight stitching, pressing, and a slight turn of the fabric is all that's needed to create this runway finish. We'll be looking at, again, the shirt tail, the curved area of the hem, and it's as beautiful on the inside as it is on the outside. Now, Linda, this is luxurious fabric.
Well, it is. It's a tie silk, which is iridescent because it has 2 different thread colors, from black and this beautiful teal color.
Oh, it's glistening. So you want to have the inside looking as great as the outside because it may show.
Well, that's right. And I use a couple of different threads, either a pure cotton thread, or I'll even use a silk thread, which really melds into the fabric beautifully.
The stitching, the first stitching is going to be stitching the width of the hem. And in Linda, in most cases, that's 3/8 of an inch.
3/8 of an inch, or even smaller. It can be 1/4 of an inch as well.
So you machine stitch along the hemline using a short stitch length. We've used about 2.0 stitch length. And you would use, of course, matching thread to your fabric. And then, after stitching, press.
Yes, and that stitch line creates this little barrier, and just is sort of asking for you to press it along that line. It falls in line really easily.
It molds along that stitching line. If you just tried to press under 3/8 of an inch, it wouldn't work.
And if you were pressing through a curve without it, it would stretch it out because it's on the bias through there.
So stay stitching as well as a pressing guide. You're going to enclose that raw edge, but we're not going to press right now.
No, that's the trick, is you don't want to make that second press with the iron. So I'm doing that a little bit by hand first, using a pin here and there to just anchor it and make sure that things are going to stay in place while I'm stitching this. So I get my pins, and I like to pin perpendicular, but you can do either one that you want.
And you kept that edge joining foot on your machine that we've used earlier.
I did, and I've moved my needle position now over to the right-hand side a couple of notches so that I can keep that blade right next to the fold of the hem, and I know now that my stitching will just fall in the right place. But I only want to stitch a few stitches at a time so that I can reposition and hold this down with my fingers.
Because with that bias, you can't sew at a speed.
No, if you sew too fast, you're going to need to find your ripper. So while I have my ripper handy all the time, I don't really want to do it on this. So little stitches at a time, maybe a ½ an inch to an inch at a time, especially through that curve. And obviously when you get to the straight part, then you're going to be more apt to just be able to stitch a little bit faster.
And that blade of the edge stitch, edge joining foot is right at the fold of the fabric.
You do want to keep your needle position in a down position as well. That's also.
And you gave me another hint. You watch the blade, you don't watch the needle.
I do. In fact, I've learned that really throughout all my sewing. I tend to want to watch the needle, but I'm really watching the blade.
And that will assure more straight stitching.
Yes.
Well, we now have shown you some of the great runway finishes and seam finishes that you can use on garments. And this one, whether it's with a tie silk, it's with a blend of another fabric, you can use this technique, making certain that you stitch, press, and then do this turning with your fabric and sewing with an edge stitch foot. I am confident that many of you watching have made a specific item such as a chemo cap, a camo quilt for the service people, a layette, perhaps a blanket for those in need. You've given it to an organization or to an individual, someone perhaps you've never met, because of the kindness in your heart. How do I know this? I know this from the response that we have from the guests we've had on Sewing with Nancy that feature volunteer sewing and quilting projects. We're going to have an update on the Tactile Quilt Project, first brought to us by Sue Outland in 2008. It was one of our very first Nancy's Corner segment. Last month, I received an update from Sue via email, and I recently talked with her on the phone, and this is what she had to say. I want to let you know that the segment you carried on your show over 2 years ago is still bringing in new quilters, fabrics, and tactile quilts. It was such a marvelous segment. I can't tell you how much it meant to the Foundation of the Blind. Even though my girls have graduated from high school, they were the girls that made the quilts during their Girl Scout days. We continue to create these quilts. I've received items from all over the country, including Europe. Sue recently told me that she spoke last week at the Foundation for Retinal Research to teach and to explain to grandparents and parents alike how to create tactile fabric quilts and toys for their children who cannot see. Here are some of these quilts. They're 51 by 51, made with 8.5-inch squares of fabric. You can add various additions with ribbons and trims that are securely stitched down, and they're easy to make. As I mentioned, the finished square is 8.5 inches, but you want to have as many interesting fabrics, touchy-feely things as possible for stimulation and growth potential for the children. So Sue encourages you to go to the Sewing with Nancy site under Nancy's Corner, and you look under Tactile Quilts. You'll find the website, and on that website you will also find instructions on how to make the quilts. There's just 2 pages that you'll print out, easy to make. You can send the full quilt, a quilt top. You can send batting if you have extra batting. She encourages that, and she just wants you to send parts or complete pieces. She doesn't care. But the interesting thing is, the week that Sue sent me this email, I received an update or a new email from a Girl Scout group. This Girl Scout group is in Spring, Texas. Tracy Murray is the Girl Scout leader of Troop 13129. And here's the note that she sent me. Over a year ago, I saw the segment on Sewing with Nancy where the Tactile Quilt for Blind Children project was featured. I told my Girl Scout troop about it, and they wanted to help. We thought it would be the perfect service project. They each learned how to use a sewing machine and serger. Some even taught their moms how to sew. The girls learned how to create different textures by adding lace and ribbons. We also learned how to recycle and repurpose clothing to make some new and usable quilts. We had our own quilting bee, where the girls hand-basted and hand-quilted. It took about 17 hours for 9 girls to finish 2 quilts. In the process, our troop learned more than just how to sew. We talked about our lives and encouraged one another. The making of this quilt has been an investment in their lives and a blessing to be part of it. how encouraging this has been that all serendipitously these two messages came up within a month of each other. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, during this next year to make something for someone you don't know, perhaps a tactile quilt, and send it to Sue at the address given at our sewingwithnancy.com website under the Nancy's Corner. So an update on tactile quilting, and for those of you who have done sewing for others, thank you so much. Next time we'll be back with Linda Lee for our second program on runway finishes. It's a great program. Hope to see you then. Bye for now.
Nancy and Linda Lee have written a fully illustrated book entitled Runway Finishes for Cool Edges that includes all the information from this two-part series. It's $14.99 plus shipping and handling. To order the book, call 800-336-8373 or visit our website at sewingwithnancy.com/2421. Order item number BK2421, Runway Finishes for Cool Edges, credit card orders only. To pay by check or money order, call the number on the screen for details. Visit Nancy's website at sewingwithnancy.com for more information on this program. Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, has been brought to you by Baby Lock, Madeira Threads, Koala Studios, Clover, Amazing Designs, and Classe Needles. Closed captioning funding provided by Rowenta. Sewing with Nancy is a co-production of Nancy Zieman Productions and Wisconsin Public Television.